I am Deborah McGregor. I am Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation. I'm a mom of two, and if I wasn't in Toronto, I would be in my community. I work at York University at the moment. So my role in working around First Nation governance around the Great Lakes, think about it in terms of different scales. At the moment, I tend to work at the regional level. Chiefs of Ontario tend to work on the Great Lakes issues. So I've been working at that level of Great Lakes for over 20 years. And their approaches, they include everybody, and not only the First Nations, about 65 of them are on the Great Lakes, it's like everybody in Ontario because everything's connected. That involved over the years renewal of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, part of implementing and working around the Canada-Ontario Agreement, which is the domestic agreement between Canada and Ontario to implement the international commitments in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. The other role that I had is I worked for Environment Canada, now called Environment Canada and Climate Change, for 10 years, and I worked on the Great Lakes file. So I worked on it from the First Nation perspective, but also from the federal government perspective. So that's what I mean, being involved in informing those sort of negotiations. I remember being like really tapped for the traditional knowledge component of it because it was finally included in the 2012 version. I worked in for Six Nations of the Grand River, who are Haudenosaunee, but I'm Anishinaabe, and I would work on Great Lakes issues from their perspective, and they had a different sort of cultural framing for how to think about health of the Great Lakes. But growing up would have been just the way that you were living would have been part of your relationship to the lakes. Like you had, like for us, we had to go down to the lake, and that's where we got our water. There was no running water at the time. It would have been that would have been where we would have went fishing. Like people really relied on fishing a lot when I was growing up, and the people still do. But you know, at that time it was high unemployment, not a lot of opportunity, so people really relied on the water and the land for just to live. Weirdly, gender is a huge part of this work. When I first started working on Great Lakes issues in the 90s, there would be very little, there would hardly be any women there. Where it actually came up for the first time, like in that kind of professional governance sort of situation, was after the Walkerton, actually. And so Chiefs of Ontario was providing a submission as part of the Walkerton inquiry, and asked me to do the traditional knowledge portion of their submission. And that's where it came up, actually meeting with different women around the Great Lakes, because weirdly at the community level, that's who they would point me to. Way back when there was the First Nations water management strategy, we were trying to develop I guess a governance framework for what that should look like, because in response to Irpawash, Ontario created the Clean Water Act, and they were engaging with First Nations to how do you want to be included in this? What does traditional knowledge look like? So every time the topic of traditional knowledge came up, that's when the topic of gender and women's role in relation to water came up. Like if you weren't talking about that, it didn't come up. It was very technical. So there started to become a lot more teachings around the Great Lakes and what those roles and responsibilities were, and started to move its way up and percolate into those broader kind of governance and political discussions, even though it was always there, but now it's starting to become explicit. The water walks by the late Josephine Mondamin were hugely influential. Very difficult for her at first to gain support. It was mostly at the community level, grassroots level, traditional people, ceremonial level, and then it started to percolate up politically, because her goal wasn't political. It wasn't to influence policy. That wasn't her intention. It was based on living up to the responsibilities. It had more to do with, I guess, empowering people. So if you look at agendas from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, you wouldn't have saw very many women on there. When I was growing up, we had fish every day, even though there was contamination in the Great Lakes and you shouldn't have, like supposedly you're only supposed to have it 3 times a week and only a certain size and everything else. But really, communities are really poor then, and that was the source of your food. So we grew up that lamprey eels were very bad. They were bad for fishing. They were that they attacked a fish, they might latch onto you. Those were the kind of stories that were being told. People would catch fish in nets, and you could see where, like with big fish, where the lamprey eel had latched on. Maybe because they didn't, that wasn't the words that people used back then, but they didn't say they were an invasive species. Despite the importance of fisheries and fish to First Nations for all kinds of reasons, cultural, social, ceremonial, food, economic, everything, they don't uncritically just accept the way that it's being managed. People don't like the spraying because it affects other things that people feel are important. Some people in meetings have said, well, we're to respect all life. The lamprey eel didn't create the mass. The lamprey eel is more like a symptom of, well, capitalism, development in the Great Lakes. It wasn't like the lamprey eel said, hey, I think we're just going to go latch ourselves onto some whitefish and make some people miserable. They gained access through, shipping through the Great Lakes. And there wasn't a lot of communication about what the management of sea lamprey. We need to think about when that's done. Like, people told stories because they wouldn't be told when the spraying was going to happen, and they would be swimming. There still isn't good communication protocols about what's happening where on the water that could impact people and their way of life, their health. Environment is very broad. It's huge compared to if you look up the definition in the Impact Assessment Act, either federally or provincially, you realize it's politically determined. So environment is a lot broader for First Nations, Indigenous peoples, I would say generally. I can't speak for all Indigenous people. And justice extends out to the natural world. There was always this consideration beyond people and had to do with obligations and responsibilities to the natural world and vice versa. There's obligations also of the natural world and relatives there to people as well. There's a reciprocal kind of relationship. It required a different, I guess, what people would call an ontology, a different way of how you understand your place in the world and what's real and what's not. So what's real is you're part of this bigger community and family, and everyone has obligations and responsibilities to each other. And you can't just focus on justice for people because it's going to be at the expense of something else. You have different relationships, different laws. So laws informs this as well because of where you are and the land that you come from and the language that's spoken there. So there isn't just like one blob of Indigenous environmental justice. And there were frameworks for doing that. So let's say in the Haudenosaunee context, that framework could be the Thanksgiving address. Is a framework for how you would consider all of those different elements. In the Anishinaabe, it could be through the 4 elements or the 7 grandfather or original teachings, grandmother teachings. People have different frameworks for how they try to understand what that is beyond people. People are there, but they're not the centerpiece necessarily. Brenda LaFrance, she was from Akwesasne, and it was a Great Lakes meeting actually. And someone said, well, why do all the stories kind of have people in them then? Well, she goes, because we're the ones who have to learn the most. We're the ones who can cause the most damage. So a lot of the teachings are directed at people. We can be so clever. We can be so smart and creative about solutions, but we're also we can also be very destructive. So we need the most teachings. We're the ones who struggle with living up to our obligations to the natural world. There's a degree of humility in that too. Scientists generally don't like to hear that. They don't like to hear that you actually know the least. The ultimate purpose is to support life. There would have to be consideration of how is the sea lamprey impacting other life. So whatever is there that took care of that isn't there in the Great Lakes. So people have to, or feel like they have to, intervene. Managed probably isn't the right word. How do you then relate to the lamprey eel in a way that's going to ensure supporting other life? Because you also don't have, and as part of the justice concept, you don't have the right to interfere with the well-being of the other entities. That means you have to hold yourself in check. It's becoming all the rage now, is what people are calling Indigenous led. But I don't think there's a really good understanding of what that is. Sometimes other people's solutions are not solutions for First Nations. I call it the development perspective. Like, if only we can convince these really primitive, ignorant people that this is the best thing for them and we need to do this, as opposed to trying to understand why people don't want that. And one of the reasons was because we're swimming when you spray it. You're not telling us when it's there, but also it's water and you should respect water. You're pouring whatever into it. And it's our river that we also govern instead of us trying to be part of these other processes. Is we want these other processes to recognize First Nations as having been here for thousands of years, had our own relationships with the Great Lakes, that we're governing. We never gave up our jurisdiction. Your own culture and traditions and language and everything else becomes part of that narrative. So instead of always being a technical solution to things or fitting into a management system that's already existing for how they've defined the problem, then that's a big that's a big shift. People want to do their own research. That's a huge shift. So to me, those are what I would consider to be the successes. We have to be recognized as people who are also governing in the Great Lakes. We're also like we're not just fitting into other people's kind of frameworks.